Salt air drifted over the Harborview district as dawn thinned the night into bruised blue. The federal courthouse, quartz and glass, all edges and light, stood back-to-back with the older county building that wore sandstone like a scowl. Between them stretched a shared lot crosshatched with reserved stencils and rusting bollards. The asphalt still slick from 4 a.m., squall that had emptied the sky and left the city smelling clean, if only for an hour. Officer Natalie Reed, white, 33, compact and coiled like a spring, sloshed out of her Port Argyle Police Department cruiser with a Renegade brewing cup in her hand and the residue of a half-slept night in her bones. She had filled the cup herself knowing the station machine ran weak and the Renegade truck opened at 5. 12 years in the Harborview Loop had taught her to create her own luck. 12 years had also taught her who moved like they owned a place. The man in the tailored navy suit and polished Oxfords, black, tall, early 40s, briefcase in one hand and key fob in the other, walked past the painted words FJ Reserve 3 without a glance, like the letters spelled his name. The Renegade logo, brown ship's will sketched on white, tilted, then upended, as Reed feigned a stumble that was more choreography than accident. Hazelnut espresso darkened the man's shoulder, punched a Rorschach stain into his lapel, and dribbled onto his tie, burgundy silk, now clinging damp to his shirt. "Watch it, courthouse clown," Reed said, her voice sugar-sweet and weaponized. She let the last drips fall, savoring gravity's slow obedience. "Know your place." The man stopped. He did not curse. He did not lunge. He breathed in the way a diver breathes before a cold plunge. The gulls quarreled on the light poles. Somewhere across the lot, a security lock buzzed someone in. "Your badge number, officer," the man said, his baritone even, his eyes steady as a physician reading an imaging scan. Reed's mouth crooked into a smile that never reached her eyes. "Good luck with that complaint." She lifted her chin toward the older courthouse. "You're nobody." A soft click sounded by his hand as his thumb brushed his key fob again. He glanced at his watch. 6:19 a.m. He made a note of the badge, for 871 stamped in black on the brass and the patrol unit painted 47 on Reed's cruiser door. He pressed the coffee from his tie, one careful pinch at a time, and looked once more at Reed's face the way surgeons look at pathology reports, cataloging shapes. He walked on, past the chain-link fence, through the walkway painted with a narrow blue line faded in the middle, straight to the federal entrance where the glass turned the morning into a mirror. His key card beeped him into the staff vestibule without delay. Inside, his phone vibrated. A text from his sister. "First day back? Mom says don't work too late. Call us." He smiled like a man who had learned to compartmentalize his worlds and pushed through the second door into sliders of silence where federal air conditioning banished Harborview's salt. 3 hours later, Internal Affairs Detective Marisol Vega clicked a black pen in Port Argyle PDSI suite and watched Officer Reed like a hawk watches a rabbit that thinks it's a coyote. Vega had worked IA a decade, watched smiles masquerade as innocence, watched anger masquerade as duty. She'd heard the language before, the soft code that blew past watchers like fog. She turned on the recorder. The clock ticked 9:32. "State your name, badge number, and assignment," Vega said. "Natalie Reed. Badge 4871, Harborview Courthouse District." What happened at approximately 6:15 a.m. in the shared lot between the county and federal courthouses? Reed leaned back, legs set in a posture that said she could sprint or fight. "I was stretching my legs after a long night. I had coffee." Guy in a suit cuts through the lot, barrel-chested into me. Coffee spills. He gets aggressive. Demands my badge number. Started threatening to file a complaint. I told him to move along. He got in my face. She shrugged. "Textbook. Courthouse types think they're untouchable." Vega made a note in block letters and only then looked at the second officer in the room. Officer Tessa McKay, white, 24, with the hurry of someone who hated empty time, picked at the nail of her thumb. She had 2 months on the job, 6 ride-alongs with Reed. She'd seen things she told herself were just how it was. "You arrived when?" Vega asked McKay. After," McKay stammered. "After the coffee thing." "Did you see the initial contact?" "No, ma'am." "Did the man make physical contact with Officer Reed?" "I know. I mean, by the time I got there she was telling him to leave. He was just standing." He asked for her badge number in this calm voice, like he was recording it in his head. She told him he should watch himself. McKay's eyes flicked to Reed, then away, as if she were staring at a sun that would not forgive a glance. Across the street, in the federal courthouse's security hub, Federal Protective Service Lieutenant Brendan O'Leary squinted at the morning duty roster as a guard, Araceli Mendez, knocked on his open door. Sir, you know who swiped in at 6:21? Mendez said, tapping the sheet. Judge Jamal Rivers. He's back from leave. There was some kind of altercation with a county officer in the lot just before he came through. Coffee spill. He didn't stop. Went straight in. O'Leary looked up as if a memory had put a fingertip to the center of his chest. Judge Rivers? Back today. Yes, sir. He's on docket rotation after family leave. Mendez hesitated. He looked composed, but his coat was stained. Pull all outside feeds between 6:10 and 6:30, O'Leary said, already moving. Make sure IT locks them. No overwrites. He didn't have to tell her to hurry. By noon, the first rumor had found the Harborview espresso truck and turned to gossip as it crossed the courthouse lawn. Before the day was done, a truth would cross both buildings like a thunderhead and crack them open. Judge Jamal Rivers sat in a windowed room on federal court's third floor, the glass looking down to where the gulls had argued at dawn. He had placed his coffee-stained charcoal blazer on the back of his chair as if it were a witness who needed to be present to testify. He had the posture of someone whose body remembered long days in rooms like this. Stillness not as absence, but as discipline. Detective Vega's shoes squeaked once on polished tile. She introduced herself and sat across from him, her notebook open to a clean page. She did not smile. He did, slightly, in the way of people who value human courtesies but have learned to calibrate them carefully. He answered her questions in a voice that had anchored countless hearings. Measured, inflected by empathy and steel. At approximately 6:17 a.m., I was walking from my parking space, FJR3, toward the federal staff entrance, he said. Officer Reed, badge 4871, approached from the county side. She altered her path to intercept mine and stopped. She held a Renegade brewing cup in her right hand. White paper, brown logo, 12 ounce. She made eye contact and said, "Watch it, courthouse clown. Know your place." She then tilted her wrist deliberately and poured the coffee onto my left shoulder. How do you know the pour was deliberate? Vega asked. Arm extension and wrist articulation, Rivers said, without flourish. Pouring onto the ground would have required a neutral wrist or a drop. Pouring onto me required rotation to aim the stream at shoulder height. Also, there was approximately 3 feet of space between us at the moment of pour, no contact or bump. The trajectory of the liquid and the stain pattern are consistent with a deliberate pour at a slight angle. Vega blinked, allowed herself the smallest nod. People who were precise this way were often telling the truth. They were also often dangerous to the comfortable. She told me I was nobody and wished me good luck with that complaint, Rivers continued. I asked for her badge number, which she had already displayed. I noted her unit number. I checked the time at 6:19. Any witnesses? Vega asked. Dr. Shana Patel, Rivers said. Forensic psychologist. She was entering the federal building for a 7 a.m. competency review. Approximately 30 feet away, across the lot. She may have taken a photograph. She carries a phone in a blue silicone case with a mandala on the back. Vega wrote the details. Through the window, a siren sighed somewhere far off. What is your role, sir? She asked, knowing but also needing the record. Rivers pressed a hand to his tie as if smoothing a thought. I work in the judicial wing. 3rd floor. Your title? There was the flicker of a pause, like a man considering whether to reveal his strongest card now or hold it a moment longer because timing mattered in this life and the next. Then, United States District Judge. Her pen paused, suspended on the page. She watched his face for any trace of the self-satisfaction that sometimes rode that title like a shadow. There was none. Only the quiet clarity of someone who had learned as a boy that power needed to be lassoed to purpose or it bucked and wrecked everything around it. Thank you, Your Honor, Vegas said, and the honorific had weight, not flattery. They went on another 20 minutes. The temperature of the coffee, lukewarm, warm enough to startle, not burn. The route he had taken, past the bollards, across the painted blue line. The words he had used and she had used, each placed back on the table like pieces in a puzzle that would only fit one way if it were to show the picture that was true. When he had finished, Rivers lifted his phone once. A text from his mother, Gloria. How was it seeing your bench again? Your father would be proud. Filled the screen. He typed, good to be home. Eventful. Call you tonight. He set the phone face down with a small care that said the device contained whole worlds anyone else might trample if he let them. Vega stood and extended her card. We'll be in touch, she said. He inclined his head, a small acknowledgement that somewhere between county and federal, between badge and bench, truth had found a steward. By late afternoon, 2 threads were unwinding in opposite directions and headed for the same knot. The first thread ran through Port Argyll PD, where Detective Vega requested phone records and body cam pull logs for Reed. She found the first absence. Reed's body cam had been under maintenance for 3 consecutive days, including this morning. The maintenance tag had been signed by a sergeant with a fondness for shortcuts. It was the kind of administrative invisibility cloak that officers wore when they wanted to be ghosts. The second thread ran through the Federal Protective Service, where O'Leary watched first one angle of the lot, then another, this time with Dr. Shahana Patel standing beside him. She wore a navy cardigan over scrubs printed with owls, and her hair was pinned back in the neatest bun in the city. When the coffee poured in 4K clarity, she flinched as if the liquid could cross the screen and sting. She held up her phone. "I took this right after," she said, voice steady. "Look at her wrist angle." She had to extend to hit his shoulder. "That's intentional. Also, the distance, about a meter. No bump." The photo held that strange calm that photographs of violence sometimes do. The person harmed, still and composed. The person doing harm in the muscular grace of their choice. "Copy that to evidence," O'Leary said. "We'll preserve all feeds." By evening, Reed's words had thickened from self-justification into fantasy. She told Officer McKay stories in the locker room about these people and respect and courthouse folk who think their job makes them special. She drafted a counter-complaint for disorderly conduct. She texted Officer Halvorsen on the gang unit. Taught another entitled "Some respect today. Coffee works better than words." Then, to Officer Pappas, "I wants to chat. Parasites don't know when to quit." She did not think about the retention policies that would snare those words like fish in a net dragged behind a boat. When Port Argyll PD served the phone warrant 2 days later, the net came up heavy. In 10 years, Detective Vega had seen men crumble, women harden, partners fold into silence, and then break with a gulping shame. Chiefs blink into the light like moths. But body cam failures multiplied like rabbits, and text messages had their own music. "Pull everything for a 5-year window," she told the analyst in digital forensics. Keywords: respect, coffee, spill, pour, teach, lesson, attitude, uppity. She wanted to add the ugliest word, but didn't. If it was there, it would surface on its own, toxic and shimmering. The analyst, a woman with half her hair lavender and the other half gray, nodded. "You'll get a book." "What about complaints?" Vega asked. "Records. 12 in the last 5 years. Records replied without even checking. She remembered because the stack had seemed like a motif. All dismissed or reduced. All black complainants. "Everything about Officer Reed goes to a central file," Vega said. "And I want every case she touched that involved accidental contact." "What are you making?" the analyst asked, detached curiosity overlaid on concern. "A picture," Vega said. By noon on Wednesday, the picture had composition. Complaint 1. Mrs. Alberta Grant, 72, grocery bags knocked from her arms during a jaywalking ticket. Reed wrote, "Subject resisted, accidental slip." Mrs. Grant had written in block letters on her form. "She looked me in the eye and swung her arm." Complaint 2. Darius Cole, 25, Gatorade poured on his new white shirt during a vehicle equipment check. Reed wrote, "Subject made aggressive move, beverage knocked accidentally." Cole wrote, "She said, respect is earned. You need to learn some." Then she smiled. Complaint 3. Dr. Naomi Holt, 39, pediatrician, shoved against her hatchback during a parking citation. Reed wrote, "Subject stumbled backward. Officer stabilized." Holt wrote, "Heavily bruised." She said, "Doctors think your letters make you better. Not here." And on. 12. A dozen threads braided into a rope that had been used to tow people through humiliation and leave them somewhere alone. Vega called them all. Mrs. Grant cried softly into the phone and then said, "I knew she did it on purpose. I also knew no one would believe me." Darius laughed once, a sound that acid had eaten the joy out of, then said, "That's the thing. She dared me to complain with her eyes. Like she'd win even if I did." Dr. Holt spoke with the crispness of someone who healed small bodies and had no room for nonsense. "Call it what it is, detective. Assault." She decided I needed a lesson. By Friday morning, the Port Argyll police chief, Bill Rowan, a man whose father's picture in uniform looked down from his office wall like a statute of limitations on guilt, sat on a conference call with the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Federal Protective Service and listened as Assistant U.S. Attorney Priya Chun, a steel-honed mind in a generous voice, outlined options. Color of law violations. Pattern and practice. 18 U.SC 242. Federal jurisdiction likely given the victim and the evidence. "We'll cooperate fully," Rowan said, the words tasting like ash because he had built entire months out of refusals to see. "We miss things. I miss things. You delegated looking away, Chen said, not unkindly. It's a common disease. He stared at the photograph of his father, suddenly sure that if the dead came back, they came back not to comfort you, but to watch you choose. Monday dawned pale over the harbor. A tanker nosed past the lighthouse. A gull stole a bagel off a bench and fled like the thief it was. Inside Federal Courthouse Room 4C, the pews filled with a mix of the ordinary and the extraordinary. Court staff, who hadn't seen a show like this since a pharmaceutical suit, had vomited 4 binders of exhibits onto the carpet. Community elders in church hats who sat straight back like pews had taught them to sit. Young men in clean sneakers whose bodies leaned forward like questions with arms. Officer Natalie Reed entered with her attorney, David Mercer, who wore worry like a tie no one had tied right. They moved past the portraits of judges who looked out from oil with the implacability of time. Reed's chin was up. The room was not her territory. She insisted, silently, that territory was something you carried. All rise, the bailiff intoned, voice amplified by a microphone that added a sliver of iron. The Honorable United States District Judge Jamal Rivers presiding. The door behind the bench opened. For a moment, time braided itself into a rope again. The asphalt lot at dawn, the coffee brown against gray wool, the words, "You're nobody," hanging like frost, and now the black robe swallowing light and making it into authority. Reed stayed seated until Mercer tugged her sleeve, and then she stood so abruptly her chair's legs screeched, the sound like a small animal dying. She looked up. Recognition hit her face the way a wave hits a sandcastle. A collapse from within, fast and messy. "You," she said before she could catch the syllable. It fell to the carpet and thudded there. Judge Rivers regarded her with the same composed gaze he had given the stain on his lapel. He addressed the room, not the person who had earned his attention the wrong way. "This matter will be handled consistent with federal law," he said, his voice carrying to the farthest wall. "Given that I am a victim in this case, I will recuse myself from presiding over the proceedings. This morning's purpose is to set preliminary conditions and refer the matter appropriately. Before that, I need to say something for the record." He paused. You could hear the sound of people not breathing. "Officer Reed," he said, turning to her, every syllable measured, never theatrical because the truth didn't need costume. "You poured coffee on a sitting United States District Judge, a black man in a suit whom you decided needed to be diminished. You called me a courthouse clown and told me to know my place. You did not know my position. That is precisely the problem. You did not assault me because I am a judge. You assaulted me because you believed I was powerless." The rustle in the gallery sounded like canvas being unfurled, like sails going up. "If you had known my title, would you have refrained?" he continued. "The more urgent question is why you felt entitled to assault any citizen you believed would have no voice. Power is not a license for humiliation. A badge is not armor against accountability." He looked to the United States flag, to the state flag, then back to the faces watching his words settle on them. "I will not preside, but I will testify," he finished, and withdrew his gaze like a surgeon removing a scalpel from an incision that had to be made open and carefully. He recused. The case was reassigned to visiting Chief Judge Elena Kostova from the neighboring district, a jurist who had survived 2 regimes, one of which wore uniforms, before she found herself in America. Her robe hung on her shoulders like a cloud made of spine. 1 week later, Judge Kostova convened an evidentiary hearing. The federal seal above her bench glowed the way light sometimes gathers around things people have decided to believe in, even if it has betrayed them before. Assistant U.S. Attorney Priya Chen rose and began a methodical dismantling that was equal parts orchestra and cross-examination. "Officer Reed," Chen said, "you've testified that this was an accidental spill. Let us examine your history of accidents." Mercer objected, pattern irrelevant, and Kostova overruled with a hand that cut the air down the middle. "Pattern is the heartbeat of this case," she said. "Proceed." Chen lifted one file. "Mrs. Alberta Grant, age 72. Groceries knocked from her hands during a jaywalking stop. Your report, subject resisted, accidental slip." "Mrs. Grant." From the back, a woman in a lavender hat stood. Her voice had the clarity of someone who had decided to sob later, not now. She looked right at me and swung her arm like she meant to. Then she said, "Watch yourself at night." Chen nodded, lifted another file. "Mr. Darius Cole, 25. Beverage poured on him during a vehicle equipment check. Your report, subject made aggressive move, beverage knocked accidentally." "Mr. Cole." Darius stood. He was in a navy blazer that didn't quite sit right across the shoulders, like he had borrowed it from a cousin and was making it his. She said, "Respect is earned." Then she dumped it on me. Smiled. Chen lifted a third file. Dr. Naomi Holt, pediatrician, pushed against her car during a parking citation. Your report. Subject stumbled backward. Officer stabilized. Dr. Holt. Dr. Holt stood with her chin up. She shoved me. Hard. I had bruises. She said, doctors think they're better. You're not special here. One by one, 12 stood. Their words were similar not because they had collaborated, but because patterns announce themselves like refrains in songs that will not leave the room once they start playing. Officer McKay's eyes had been cast down since the day began. When Chen called her, she flinched as if touch were a thing that could cross air. Officer McKay, Chen said gently, as if inviting a child to put down something heavy. You arrived after the initial contact in the lot. You've been Officer Reed's partner for the past 6 weeks. Did you ever witness behavior that made you uncomfortable? McKay took a breath that scraped like a match head. Yes, she said. Her words. The way she talked about people, especially black women and men. Like they needed teaching all the time. Like handing out little punishments for disrespect was the job. I told myself it was just talk. She swallowed. I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner. Did she ever talk about coffee? Chen asked. A weird, almost hysterical laugh wanted to jump out of McKay's mouth, but she clamped her jaw until it stopped. She used to say coffee lands better than a lecture. McKay's eyes slid to Reed, who stared back with a fury that was half betrayal, half recognition that the dam had failed. Digital forensics read the texts aloud. Screens lit with messages that sounded like a defense built out of cliches and then set on fire by evidence. Another night watching the courthouse. These people think they own it. Time to remind them who has power. Taught another entitled some respect today. Coffee works better than words sometimes. I wants to poke around. Parasites. The courtroom air cooled as if the building's vents had been commanded to choke off heat. Words do that to rooms when intent is no longer free to fly. Judge Kostova's gaze never left Reed. She was building an edifice of fact and wanted the defendant to see every brick go up. Officer Reed took the stand. Mercer tried to rebuild the sandcastle. Officer Reed, he began, voice massaged into honey. 12 years of service. You've been in volatile situations. You've made split-second decisions. You've never been disciplined. Is that correct? Yes, Reed said, gripping the arms of the chair until her knuckles blanched. Would you ever target a citizen because of their race? Mercer asked, disdain infused in the very premise to make it seem absurd. No, Reed said. Never. Chen's cross came without hurry. Officer Reed, Chen said, soft voice, sharp edge. What did Judge Rivers do to you to deserve coffee poured on his suit? He bumped me, Reed said. It sounded like a line reading rather than a memory. The federal video shows 3 feet of distance, Chen said. No bump. Your wrist rotates. You pour. You say, know your place. Would his place have been different if you'd known he was a federal judge? Mercer objected, speculative, and Kostova overruled. Answer. Reed's jaw worked. I didn't know who he was. That was the question, Chen said. Would you have done it if you'd known? Reed's mouth opened, closed. She thought of the lot, the early air, the taste of hazelnut. She thought of the speed with which humiliation had brightened her morning. No, she said finally. So assault is unacceptable for judges, but acceptable for citizens you consider nobodies, Chen said, the word falling like a hammer on the table it had been placed on. Your texts refer to teaching entitled People Respect. 12 complaints over 5 years. All black civilian complainants. All dismissed or reduced. A coincidence. People don't respect the badge anymore, Reed said. The sentence had the sad ring of tired religion rather than law. Chen stepped closer. Respect is not obedience under humiliation. Respect is what you give to a grandmother crossing a street, a doctor parking for work, a young man in his car, a judge walking to his courthouse, before you know their titles, not because of them. Mercer objected to the sermon. Kostova allowed the question because moral clarity is admissible when law is the language we use to write our morality down. Chief Rowan took the stand like a man opening his own chest. He admitted to processes designed to believe a uniform over a complaint. He admitted that body cams that malfunctioned found their way back onto suspicion's backs quietly. He promised reforms with the desperation of someone who needs to make a different picture to erase the one he'd been framed into. The gallery listened as people said the things they should have said sooner. They looked across the aisle and recognized neighbors. They filled the benches with oxygen when justice sucked it out. Judge Rivers sat in the witness section, hands folded, a tidy stack of papers beside him with his own name on the tab. He did not speak until called. When he did, he recounted the morning without anger, as if anger were expensive and he had learned to spend it only on what could not be bought any other way. He described the wrist rotation and the distance, the stain pattern, and the time. He did not need to repeat Reed's words because they had already become a toxin that the room was processing in its collective liver. Chin's closing was brief. "We are not here for vengeance," she said. "We are here to ensure that the tag on a uniform does not act as a magic cloak. We are here to say that nobody is a word we will not permit in our officers' mouths when they look at our citizens. We are here because a judge was assaulted, yes, but more because 12 citizens were diminished for years by a pattern of petty cruelty disguised as policing. The law's patience is finite. The law's memory is long. The law's voice is yours, Judge." Mercer argued split-second and context and stress. He tried to pull a fabric of sympathy taut across facts that were not capable of being covered. Judge Kostova delivered the verdict like a surgeon's consent. Measured, transparent, unflinching. "Officer Natalie Reed," she said, and the room turned still. "The evidence demonstrates a sustained pattern of civil rights violations under color of law. The initial incident against Judge Rivers was not an accident. It was an expression of a belief about power and humiliation. The 12 prior complaints form a constellation that cannot be explained as coincidence. You are judged guilty of violating 18 U.S.C. Section 242". Reed's lips moved as if to form a refusal. None came. "Sentencing," Judge Kostova continued, "will reflect the seriousness of using state authority to inflict harm. 3 years in federal custody. Forfeiture of pension. Permanent prohibition from law enforcement employment. Mandatory bias intervention counseling. This court further recommends a Department of Justice pattern and practice investigation into the Port Argyll Police Department for systemic failures in complaint review and body camera compliance." Chief Rowan closed his eyes. When he opened them, he felt older and, for the first time in years, like a recruit again, stumbling through a course he had to pass to earn the right to wear a city's trust on his chest. As marshals led Reed away, Mrs. Grant pressed a hand to her lavender hat to keep it steady and held her head a fraction higher. Darius Cole exhaled as if he had been holding breath since his white shirt had clung to his chest. Dr. Holt's eyes shone with the complex light of relief and anger, having a conversation and agreeing to return later to finish it. The case did not end there because the good ones never do. They ripple. A month later, the Port Argyll City Council voted to establish an independent civilian oversight commission with subpoena power. Body camera compliance was moved out of the department to an external vendor, audits public by default. A hotline for misconduct complaints took calls 24 hours a day and published anonymized data monthly. The union filed a predictable grievance that the courts weighed and rejected because process had been kept like a candle in a storm. Chief Rowan submitted to the DOJ investigation with a penitent zeal that made some officers snicker and others look at him with something like wary respect. He retired 6 months later. In his final speech, he quoted his father without naming him. "You don't hold a city together by scaring it into submission. You hold it together by being worth its fear." In the federal building, a glass case appeared on the 3rd floor outside courtroom 4C. Inside, on a simple mount, sat a charcoal blazer with a coffee stain still etched into wool fibers like a map of a river delta. A small plaque beneath it read, "Evidence, Harborview Lot, 6:17 a.m. Dignity does not evaporate when doused." Donated by the Honorable Jamal A. Rivers. Law schools around the state added the case to their first-year criminal law syllabi under the Unit on Color of Law. The Rivers Fellowship, funded by a consortium of firms and foundations, placed 2 students a year with civil rights organizations working on police accountability and community healing. The fellowship statement said, "Justice delayed is not justice denied when courage meets record-keeping." At Renegade Brewing, the truck owner, a woman named Kate with tattoos of forks on her forearms, created a new roast, Harborview Reckoning. Bold, clean, no bitterness in the finish. 5% of profits went to a nonprofit that provided legal aid for victims of low-level abuse that never made headlines but corrodes a life just the same. Judge Rivers called his mother the evening of the verdict. Gloria Rivers had lived through bus rides in which she had kept her hands folded because the world did not like it when black girls took up space. She listened, hummed once in that way that knit her son back into a history he had always belonged to, and said, "Use what you have, baby. Use it clean." He thought of clean like something you could hold up to light and see through. He thought of the day in the lot and the way Reed's face had looked when the bench turned out to be a mirror. He thought of 12 people standing as if their ancestors had braced their ankles from below. He slept that night without dreams for the first time in months. But stories do not only ripple forward, sometimes they echo back. On a Saturday morning 2 weeks after sentencing, Officer Tessa McKay knocked on a row house door in the Riverton neighborhood. It was painted sunflower yellow and needed a second coat. Darius Cole opened it wearing a soft t-shirt and the wary look of someone for whom uniformed visitors were rarely bearers of good. "I'm off duty," McKay said quickly. "I won't take long." She looked different out of blue. Smaller, somehow, without the scaffolding. She held out an envelope. "There's a form in here for the Oversight Committee. If you want to help them build out their training programs, tell them what it felt like. I think it would matter." Darius looked at the envelope, and then at her like a person watching a dog he'd seen bite now extend its belly for a rub. "Why?" he asked raw. "Because I stood there," she said. "I told myself I didn't see. I'm trying to see now. I don't know if that matters to you, but it matters to me." She tucked the envelope into the fence between them and stepped back. "No pressure." Darius took it halfway. "You still on the job?" he asked. "For now," she said. "Trying to make sure the next person partnered with me comes home better than they were when they woke up." He smiled despite himself. It was small, and it was allowed. In a bookstore a few blocks from Harborview, Dr. Naomi Holt stood at a microphone on a Thursday evening and read a chapter from her forthcoming book on medical bias and community trust. She had written a chapter on being shoved against a car and feeling the sharp edge of a hatchback dig into her lumbar spine while she stared at a scuffed sneaker she had bought on sale because she had maxed her student loan forgiveness year. She thanked the Rivers Fellowship for supporting a student who had helped her with research. She took questions. A young woman asked how she stayed angry without being consumed by it. "I don't," Dr. Holt said, and the room laughed softly. "I let it burn, and then I make a soup with what's left. Then I feed people." In church the next Sunday, Mrs. Alberta Grant wore her lavender hat and told the story to her pew neighbor as if it were a parable about mustard seeds and mountains. 12 of us," she said, stood up. 12 is a good number, biblically. Jury size, too. A full dozen, if you're baking. God likes his symmetry. Port Argyle's skyline did not change because one case changed. The ships still slid in and out with the tide's moods. The gulls still argued on light poles. The smell of hazelnut and diesel still braided itself low over the lot at dawn. But the lot felt different to those who crossed it now. It had shed something. The thin veil that separates the moment before a humiliation from the moment of it. People walked across it with their shoulders the width they earned in sleep, not narrowed by anticipation. In room 4C, on a day when the docket ran light and a junior clerk had time to breathe, she found herself standing before the glass case and the blazer and the stain. She was 26 and new to the city. She had come for a job and stayed for the feeling that even as the harbor heaved, the law's floor held. She read the plaque and looked at the blazer and imagined the morning when a man had been told he was nobody and then had walked into a room where his job was to recognize the somebody in everyone who entered. She put her palm flat against the glass. The cool met her skin like a promise that needed to be renewed each day or it spoiled. She turned away and flicked off a light. Outside, as if on cue, the Renegade Brewing truck hissed steam into the cool and handed a coffee to a nurse getting off a night shift and a construction worker clocking in and a public defender with papers spilling from a canvas bag. The Harborview reckoning smelled like what you drink when you plan to tell the truth. The truth did not bring Reed back her badge or her certainty. In a dormitory 4 states away, she woke for the 3rd time and stared at Cinderblock and counted 4 cracks above her cot. She thought of coffee and wrists and a man's voice that had not raised itself even when she had tried to drown it. She thought of herself at 22, thrilled by the heft of the badge, the way it made strangers' eyes do math. She thought of her mother's text, unanswered. "I saw the news. Call me. We raised you to be kind. Where did it go?" She turned over and let the rumor of sleep take her again. Judge Rivers did not think of her much. He thought of systems as machines that could grind you up unless you placed a hand in the right gear at the right time. He thought of training curricula and oversight committee rosters. He thought of his sister's children and whether he could make it to their soccer game Saturday. He thought of the day he had trailed Congressman Lewis around the courthouse as a summer intern and learned that courage is not heat but endurance. He thought of the lot only when he crossed it. And then he thought, everything is ordinary until it isn't. On a rain-scrubbed morning a year later, he paused on that painted FJ and felt the air cool his face. A young officer in a rain jacket approached, black, late 20s, cheeks still soft with untested days. He nodded, deferential but not diminished. "Morning, Your Honor," he said. "Morning," Rivers said. The officer looked toward the lot. "We redid the cameras." He grinned without showing teeth. "They see like cats now." Rivers smiled. "Let them," he said. He went inside and took the bench, and the first case on the docket was an eviction stayed because a landlord had tried to shortcut repair obligations. The second was a sentencing hearing where a young man's grandmother stood to say he had found work at the shipyard and did not need prison to learn the consequence of a mistake. The third was a motion to suppress evidence from a traffic stop because the officer had cited furtive movements without explaining what the movements were. Rivers granted the motion. He wrote the order with ink that would read cold and clean in the record. Even as below the words he carried the warmth of hazelnut and the weight of a coffee cup tipped through a wrist whose rotation turned into a pivot point for a city trying to decide who it was. When court adjourned, the clerk handed him a sticky note with a name and number and call back fellowship. He nodded and pocketed it. He turned to the window and watched a gull soar, and then drop, and then soar again, as if indecision were a sport rather than a condition. He thought of dignity and its enemies. He thought of reckoning and its recipes. He thought of the particular goodness of a city that could look itself in the mirror for once and not flinch. Outside, a nurse laughed at something the renegade owner said, and then the truck hissed again, like a dragon exhaling after deciding not to burn a village today. The lot kept its secrets now on hard drives, and the secrets did not rot there, because people came to collect them and make them into truth. The truth walked itself into rooms where it had sometimes been shushed, and took a chair, and crossed its legs and said, "We're going to do this differently now." And when people asked what happened, they were told a story that began with a coffee cup and a handful of words spoke like a curse, and ended, "No," continued. With a city discovering that justice, like tidewater, comes in if you make the channel deep and clean and stubbornly open to the sea.